Yeah. All right. ScottCast, the podcast, number 25. Always wanted to do that. All right. So we have a familiar guest today, David Bilka, financial planner extraordinaire. And, David, you and I had a long conversation last time about a variety of topics. But one of the things that I think I didn't know that much about was the classes that you teach.
Right.
So just for starters, tell us where you do that, who tends to come to those classes, and what an overall expectation might be.
Yeah, so I do the class before COVID. I did them live at Lake Sumter State College, and for several years now I've been doing it at UCF. And the format of the class is it's 2 3-hour sessions, and we go over the key areas of retirement planning, investments and retirement income planning, tax planning, the main key topics. And with COVID though, we switched it to Zoom. And so we did the last version of it, Zoom exclusively on Zoom. We're about to do another session on Zoom exclusively as well. But then the idea is when COVID is over, that we'll do both. We'll offer it on Zoom, and then we'll also offer it live.
Do you feel like it loses something in Zoom, or no? You feel like it's been going pretty good?
It's definitely different. It's been going well. I was surprised, actually, when I did it that, I had never done it on Zoom before. And but I was, I'm able to share the screen and have the PowerPoints. People are able to ask questions. Some people told me it was more convenient for them, because their work schedule.
Sure.
People could take it from out of state. They didn't have to live close to the campus. So it actually, when COVID originally happened, I was fearful that what am I going to do? We can't get into group settings.
Sure.
But then Zoom actually open up, or doing it online, open up a whole things that I didn't even think about before. But it is different, as opposed to doing it live. A little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to add here is just dawned on me is that we talked about last time. You actually teach CFPs how to be CFPs.
Yes.
And my point where I'm going with that is, when you're taking these classes from you at UCF, which are basically advising classes, teaching people how to manage their money, how to manage their process, how to manage their, basically accumulate wealth and how to do it thoughtfully and efficiently, they're learning from a guy who teaches people who will eventually become advisors and then pass that knowledge on. So they're really skipping over straight to the source. Which I think is kind of cool. I mean, how many people get that opportunity? So it's neat that you do that. Yeah. So, all right. So somebody goes to a wealth planning or retirement planning class. When they leave, are they experts, or are they just a little farther along than they were when they got there, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, well, you think about it. I mean, it's interesting you brought together the CFP classes I teach, 2 CFP candidates, so financial planning professionals.
You teach the teachers.
Yes, right? And then the class for the general public, so to speak, right? So people approaching retirement. Mm-hmm. And the class I teach to the general public is a compressed version of a 2-year CFP program. So you're right. So people will get an introduction to the key ideas. They get some good quality education, but it would be too much to say, or a stretch to say they're going to become experts in the different fields.
Right. I feel like a lot of times when what we're learning to do sometimes when we're dealing with professionals, whether it's the person who fixes your car, or the person who fixes your plumbing, or the computer tech, heaven forbid. You're really not trying to learn what they do. You're just learning better to interact with them. You're learning to ask better questions. And I think that's what comes from that. Like, I ride motorcycles. Do I kind of know how to fix a motorcycle? A little bit. But I do now know, after having ridden them for as long and dealing with mechanics, what questions to ask about my motorcycle when I feel like something's not going right. So, I mean, I think that's really, at the end of the day, people, you correct me if I'm wrong, are not trying to become experts or replace us, me and you, I hope, because I have bills, that sort of thing. But they're really just trying to learn to interact better with us. Right. In most cases.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. Let me hone in on estate planning as an example. So in the class, I go over, for one of the things I go over, hey, here's proper ways to title your assets, proper ways to set up beneficiary designations. It's basically the differences between them. In the end, though, I'm not an estate planning attorney. I don't draw up the documents for people. But when they go meet with that estate planning attorney and they get that 1 hour, that they at least have an idea what they're doing, what the purpose of it is, what the difference between setting up a TOD versus a revocable trust, the basics of it.
Yeah, because I think what that does is it makes meetings more efficient. I call it, we do something with clients I call third base accounting, where we get them most of the way around the field. We say, look, here's some questions you want to ask. Here's some things I've noticed. Here's some new tax law you might want to bring up when you meet with your CPA. I'm not a CPA. I'm not going to sign the document. I'm not going to send it off to the IRS. But when clients leave you and I think after a tax discussion, it probably cuts the first half an hour of that conversation out, where they're trying to get educated. Now they're just going in, not completely, but largely ready to have a thoughtful conversation.
That's a fair observation. Yes.
Good.
And a side note is, I don't, from your experience, but from my experience, what I found with CPAs, and I'm not trying to replace a CPA. They do really good work, and I don't want to do clients' tax returns. But I found that there are CPAs, accountants that are tax preparers. The really good ones, though, are tax planners.
Yeah.
And so I think part of the value of what we bring is we're trained to be tax planners, or try to see things before they happen.
Yes.
Or know the tax consequence before it happens.
Yeah, some I've heard some certain, not all, certainly CPAs described as historians. They want to know what happened.
Right.
They're looking back to see where your columns are and if things are in the right place and it all adds up based on what did happen. Our job, by its very nature in securities and in planning, is about what is going to happen or could possibly happen. So I think the marriage of those two conversations is really fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
If done right.
A collaboration if done right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So you talked about kind of taking 2 years worth of CFP material, which is daunting to me, and creating these classes. So what is the format of the class? Do they come in and they get kind of this, is it a few classes? Is it more than a few classes?
Yeah. So there's 3 parts to it. It's and there first are 2 3-hour sessions, and we do take breaks. I'm not a machine.
Yeah.
So it's the first session we go over. The goal is to get through about 3 of the topics. There's 5 to 6 topics. We get 2 to 3 completed. And then there's a second session, which is another 3 hours. And then the third session, which is optional, is they can meet with me for a personalized review of their situation. And also, we actually, last few years, we've been offering a financial plan, to do a financial plan as well.
Oh, nice.
And there's no cost or obligation to do it.
Yeah.
So that's the basic format of it.
It's funny you bring that up. I think that people don't realize the effort that goes into a financial plan sometimes, and the difficulty and the data you have to gather, and it's a fairly in-depth process if you do it right. So I think there's a ton of, I know when my team sits down, and you know this because, well, we're on the same team, when we sit down with our juniors or our planners or our CFAs and the people we work with to build portfolios, it can be several hours of work for a very highly educated group of individuals. So to get you to do that even on some smaller scale is actually a pretty neat thing. Which brings me to another point. Where would you think, outside of your classes, of course, and people like you who do this, where do most people get their financial education from? Right,
and it's not in our formal schooling system. So where do people get their financial education? What their neighbor tells them, what their mom or dad tells them, what they Google. So I look at my own growing up, and there was no internet and Google and all that stuff. And my parents did not have a formal financial education by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the fortunate things was their parents grew up in the Depression, so they had some pretty important relationship with money in the respect of, okay, you live within your means.
Wait, what?
You
Say
live.
that again?
You live. As I mentioned in a previous one, they were frugal but not cheap, right?
Sure.
And then my dad did get my grandfather. My grandfather was an investor. He was one of those. He was a stock picker, investor, had a broker and all that.
He had a Robinhood account.
Right. And so there's a story where, I remember my dad telling me the story, and I'm young when he tells me the story, and he said that, when he was a young man, he had married my mom, and
Things
sorry
just
about
got
that.
weird, Ben.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry. Married my mom, and my grandfather told him, "Hey, Dan," my dad's name was Dan. You should think about investing, and investing to my dad was Greek or Swahili. Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
That's what rich people do.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so he didn't accept the rejection. He said, "No, come with me. You're going to go to my broker's office. We're going to buy some stock." And my dad told me he went in there, and there must have been a pretty high-tech brokerage firm because this is over 50 years ago.
Right.
But he says he remembers seeing the ticker symbols go by. And he wanted to cower up into a fetal position and just like cry. Like,
what is this?
He says, well, I want to get the heck out of here.
Yeah.
He was intimidated. And so my grandfather, fortunately, bless my grandfather, said, "You know what, Dan, we're going to start we're going to start small, or we're going to start, basic. Let's buy utility stock." And so my dad's first stock he bought was Southern Company.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Still around today.
And soon after that, his employer offered a 401k.
Yeah.
And he just started maxing out in that thing. Now,
Right.
he started doing that in his 30s. He had zero financial education.
Yeah.
He was intimidated by it.
Yep.
But because he made those decisions,
Yep.
he and my mom were able to retire in their 60s and move to Florida and have a good life.
That's so telling to me. In all my years, over the years, I'm sure you and I have discussed, I used to speak to 401k groups on a pretty regular basis.
Right.
And the first thing I would tell is sometimes it'd be 100 people in the room, and I'd say, first of all, stop worrying about investing. We'd have a room full of people discussing which mutual fund or which index or which. Meanwhile, they haven't put a dime in the plan yet, right? So they're preoccupied with what thing to pick, and there's no money to pick with. So what your grandfather got your father to do really was just begin a disciplined process. He could have bought Southern Company, he could have bought Duke Power, he could have bought IBM, he could have bought Coke, whatever. The idea is that if you have a discipline and you save, you have to be a saver first. That's
Right.
the thing that aggravates me to no end, is people are inundated with this information about investing, and they
Right.
haven't even begun saving.
Right.
So once you save and you have a pot of money, then the concerns about what to put it in, or whether it's Southern or Duke or whatever, those come into play. Well, what your grandfather really did was teach your dad a discipline, starting with saving, and then I'm sure his education on investing grew from there. Is that a fair?
It is, but then so that was a critical decision point of his life, was starting to invest in his early 30s. But then when he did retire, and this was a big reason why I became a financial planner, was when my mom and dad retired, they moved to Florida. My son was born, who's now 20. But my dad retired at 62, and he retired in the year 2000. Which you and I both know that was the beginning of a 3-year bear market. Mm-hmm. And my dad was also very heavy in tech stocks, which
Everybody was.
Everybody was in the 90s. You could be an orangutan and pick
Juniper, Cisco. I can name them for you if you want.
Yeah, I remember there was this one, I can't remember the name of it, but there was a tech fund that made like 212% one year.
Net.
Okay.
Trust me, anybody who's in the business in that era remembers that fund.
Okay.
Well, and a quick aside is
Sure.
that there were 3 tech funds. Well, so for those that don't remember, which includes Vin and Ash, because they were barely alive at that point, is in 99, the market was up a considerable amount, and all the tech funds were up 80, 90, 100%, 110% in some cases, Munder net being the one. And 1 out of every $3 in 2000 that went into those products.
Wow.
And what that means is those people all showed up late to the party. You go to the party and you show up at 1, everybody says it's a great party, and about the time you get there, everybody leaves, and then the cops come. That's what happened here. The cops showed up in 2000 and arrested everybody who bought Munder net. So,
right.
Not to interrupt your story, but it is a classic tale.
So what happened is my parents, because my mom was involved in that, of course, as well, got the lesson, hey, just invest. Put it in the market, don't worry about it, right? Yeah. And they did it young enough where they could accumulate some wealth. But when they retired, now you're retired, and that's a whole nother, you're dealing with multiple layers, which the class covers.
Yes.
And so, first of all, my dad, the market went down. The S&P, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, but I think it went down 43% in cumulative over those 3 years.
That's about right, because it was a lost decade. I mean, from 2000 to 2010, you made a big goose egg in terms of capital appreciation in the S&P 500.
And because my parents were overweighted in tech, they were down even more than that. So, number one, their allocation wasn't spread out. It was way too aggressive for someone about to retire.
Sure.
But then also my dad started making some decisions about where to take the money from, which wasn't tax efficient. They needed to get estate planning set up because they moved from Ohio to Florida, and you got to go by state law with estate planning.
Right.
And so my parents were making mistakes that they didn't even know they were making. It's one of those expressions, you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
And then that's where they met a colleague we both know, a CFP, who then helped them out tremendously, and I witnessed that, was part of it. They got some education, in the beginning, had some good values with money in the beginning, but then really needed some assistance, when they retired.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for just a second. And I think this is a critical thing that gets lost on people, is when you retire, when you're growing money, I'm not going to say it's easier, but it's easier when you're growing money, when you're saving, you're not spending out of that bucket of money you accumulated, right? So when you switch from the guy or gal throwing money in the bucket to the guy or gal taking money out of the bucket, things get very real at that moment. Because think about it. And I've experienced this thousands of times over with a client where they're putting money in a 401k and the market's going down, right? Market's going down, market's going down, market's going down. But they're putting money in. And so oftentimes their company's putting money in. So that 10% decline doesn't feel all that bad because they started the year with $100,000, it dropped to 90, but they put, between them and the company, they put $10,000 back in, so they're break even in this terrible year, right? So it doesn't feel bad. I'm still break even, it's not the end of the world. Then they retire. They still got $100,000, right? And now they're spending $5,000 or $6,000 now they're taking it out of their bucket, and the market's down. So that 10% drop is they're not only down 10%, but they spent $5,000 or $6,000.
Right.
So now they're down $17,000 on $100,000. That feels terrible. So managing that expectation in dictating, which you alluded to, when to take money out to meet your needs is critical, immensely critical when you're retired. When you're accumulating money, it's kind of, I don't want to say set it and forget it. It's not obviously not that simple, but it's certainly more true of that end than the end you described, which is why what got real when your parents retired and the market went down.
Right.
So, I mean, it's an ongoing story with clients, getting them acclimated to spending versus contributing.
To piggyback on that there's also, part of what I cover in the beginning of the class is, retirement is, you're making financial decisions, but you're also making life decisions. There's I'm not a psychologist here. I know your wife is, so she can perhaps join us.
She has to be in my case.
But there's a psychological shift you're dealing with as well, where especially if you're, for anybody, but if you're a professional and your identity's with your profession, you had status, this and so forth, and then one day you wake up in the morning, and it's a very different life. And and so I have part of the classes we talk about. Okay, first of all, there isn't one way to retire. Sometimes people will consult for a year or two after, or do something part time. But one of the things we talk about is when you look at the research of what makes a quote successful retirement. Of course, having money or having assets gives you more gives you more options, makes you more comfortable. But what the research shows is what makes people happy or quote successful is number one, do they have a sense of purpose? And so that's something where I can't answer that for anybody, right? You have to figure out what your purpose is. It can mean volunteering. It can mean being a full-time grandparent. It can mean being more active in your church. It can mean starting a new career. It can mean anything. But if you go from a sense of purpose when you're working to now this kind of vacuum, that's a big part of it there.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that, and sometimes you and I both know, sometimes people's purpose becomes looking at their investments every 35 seconds. So we don't necessarily want that to be your purpose.
Right.
You got this far without micromanaging it, you'll probably be okay down the road. But no, I think those are excellent points. I read a story about along these lines. They were giving an example of somebody sees a retired doctor on the street and says, "Hey, didn't you used to be Dr. Bilka?" And he says, "I thought I still was," but because you do kind of lose that sense of identity or what your profession is. And we know statistically, and you and I have retired enough people, I've retired literally thousands of people, and watched them retire different ways and there used to be this thought, well, when you're 65, you're tired, you want to sit in your easy chair and watch TV all day. We both know that that's immensely unhealthy, and that was born out of an era when people mostly did manual labor. Right. Our grandparents and our great-grandparents worked at a factory, or they dug a hole, or they mined coal, or they did a variety of things ain't none of us doing right now for the most part, right? We're in an air-conditioned building. We're just not as physically worn out. And so we're not really ready to sit in the easy chair. And we know, I know personal experience. I have watched people retire, and I've watched their health fall apart if they just become sedentary, don't use their minds, don't get out and volunteer. And then I've seen the opposite of that work. Well, I have a client who's 92 who runs 2 miles every day. Yeah. So again, your point is so critical. I think people dismiss the mental part of this. You want to speak to that a little bit? I mean, what is the feedback you get in classes?
From classes, from experience, the feedback is, first of all, let's just say for a moment, if you're with someone, you're married, you have a significant other. Yes. That it's important to have, what does retirement life look like? You have that discussion before it actually happens.
You really should. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but I have a client who's very fond of telling me that she married her husband for better or worse, but not for lunch. So he retired as a physician and now follows her around the kitchen all day. She does not care for that all that much. Yeah.
And a corollary to do you have a sense of purpose is, how connected are you with others? And often they come together. Whatever gives you purpose, you're connected with people. And so that's also, when you look at it, where you retire, you're now disconnected from your profession, your colleagues and all that. Your kids are busy professionals, or busy themselves. They have their own kids. They may live in another state. Yeah. You got to figure things out. You do. And so just like you want to plan for the financial part in advance, try to do as much as you can to plan for the mental part in advance. And often it depends on the person. I always ask, especially when a client retires, I watch them a little more carefully, right? Hey, how you doing? Probe a little more than the generic how you're doing. And then I'll eventually ask, at what point did you make that mental shift from work/profession to retirement? And the answer is different. Some people say it took me over a year. Some people say I'm still trying to figure that out. Some people say it was day one.
Yep.
But one other a comment about that is the way retirement is marketed to us. I have an office in Claremont, as you know, in Lake County. And when you go out down 27, or if you get up into the villages, there's billboard after billboard of people sipping pina coladas by the pool, basically, right?
Right.
And it's marketed as a permanent vacation.
Yes.
And so that's where we talk about that. Where I don't know about you, but when I go on vacation, I start getting a little batty after the second. If it goes beyond 2 weeks,
Yeah.
I start getting a little
Oh, I
stir
would
crazy.
never make it 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my wife's from Europe, so we would take, it doesn't make
Right.
sense to go there for a week and a half. Anyway, so the data shows, the research shows, very small percentage of retirees who live the permanent vacation are happy.
I can bear that out. I can.
Some are.
Confirm it.
Right, maybe a few.
Yeah.
But, again, having a sense of purpose, being connected with others are the more important factors.
Yeah, and I think what's really something to consider for people in this day and age, and I'm seeing it more and more and more, is not this abrupt ending. Like, okay, today I'm a high-powered executive, tomorrow I'm sitting on the recliner.
Right.
I see people more and more gliding into that, where, it's 4 years out, now I'm going to work 4 days a week. And then they get down to 3 days a week. And even after quote-unquote retirement, they may consult back. So, and there's a book called The New Retirementality.
Yeah.
Which is I recommend it to anybody. And it talks about that there's a gap of people, especially in certain white-collar jobs, between, say, the people who are now 65 and the people that are 45, right? There's a gap there. So these 65-year-olds who are attorneys or engineers or physicians or whatever are going to be able to really say, look, I'll consult back to you once a week. Mm-hmm. You might not see me for a month, but in return for that, you're going to pay me this much per hour. Now, the companies love it because they don't have to pay HR benefits.
Right.
There's a whole great benefit to not having them as W-2 employees, but 1099 employees. The point being that you can kind of ease into it.
Right.
Rather than, again, I was working 80 hours a week last week, now I'm working 0.
Right. No, and that's where, keeping your mind active and remaining connected with others, that helps in the transition and eventual hanging it up permanently, so to speak.
And lastly, when people finish your class and you see them later, or maybe sometimes they even become your customers or clients, when they leave the class, what's the general feeling of, hey, I really got this out of your class?
I get a lot of comments of, I wish I would have taken this class when 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
Right.
Hey, can my kids take your class? I wish the whole theme of I wish I would have known this before. Sometimes I'll get comments about, I go over like a tax law change, or just go over, like, for example, like the inherited IRA/beneficiary IRA. I'll ask people, I'll survey them. It's easier to do this live than on Zoom, but hey, how many of you even have heard of a beneficiary IRA? And usually nobody knows about it. And then I'll explain it, and then I'll get people say, gosh, I went into the bank. My mom died 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. I went into the bank, and they told me I had to take all the money out. I wish I would have talked to you before that, because, that's where there's a whole lot in what we do that if it's unknown or it's not, help me out. It's like,
well, it's the end. It's not as tangible as I got 10% or 12%. It's more qualitative kind of stuff where somebody walks into the bank, and I'm not picking on banks.
Right.
Actually, I am picking on banks. You walk into the bank, and someone there greets you, and you say, look, my mom died, I need to get the IRA. And we'll fill this form out, and they hand you a check for $200,000. You walk out, cash it, put it in the bank, and go buy a Ferrari. and in April of the next year, you get a tax bill for $50,000. And you say, well, wait a minute, why did that happen? It happened because somebody at the bank handed you a check and you cashed it, versus dealing with someone like you who would say, well, there's this thing called a beneficiary IRA and all the things that would avoid, well, first you wouldn't get the Ferrari, but second of all, you wouldn't pay the taxes on the full amount right away. And that's a subtle conversation. That's an esoteric part of our business. You can't really grasp what that means, but for somebody it might mean $50,000 worth of tax savings.
Right.
So there is value in those types of conversations for sure. So any last point you'd like to make about the class or the value of it, or who should take it? Yeah, well, who should take it? I mean, anyone who is concerned about or planning on retiring at some point could take it. Usually it's people who are approaching retirement are the ones who tend to take the class. They're kind of in the red zone, as I like to say, 55 and above. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. That's the biggest range, is 55, 65. Yeah. Sometimes, when people are working longer, I'll get people in their late 60s taking the class. Yeah, I mean, and I could picture some of the questions. Like if you're 55, I don't know how long the average American stays at one place, but engineers, for example, they're switching jobs every 3 or 4 years. Do you run into a situation where, I know you do, you run into situations where the person's 55, 57, they're like, all right, well, this is getting real. I'm not getting any younger. I've got an old 401k over there, and then there's that one annuity I think I bought back in 83, and then I had this life insurance policy. I think it has cash value, and then I have a pension, but I don't really know what it pays. And the list becomes 7, 8, 9 things long of stuff they have here, there, and everywhere, with no idea of how it all comes together to provide a check in the mailbox every month when they go to retire. Now, I just dated myself because nobody gets a check in the mailbox anymore, but you know what I mean. So do you encounter that conversation quite a bit? That's actually, that's a great point, where people say, hey, you forced me to put all this stuff together. You forced me to look at things I hadn't looked at in blank number of years. Right. And you help me understand how they all come together. Yeah, so I think the answer to my question is who should take it is probably a lot of people would benefit regardless of their, as long as they're adults, I would suppose. I don't think an 8-year-old's going to get a whole lot out of it. But, but I think that adults should take the class, but more specifically, from what I know about your classes, is if you're 55 and above and you're getting into that red zone where it's getting real, this is probably going to happen. It sounds like it would be a wonderful idea for them to take this class. Thank you, Scott. Very cool. All right. Vin, are you awake over there? Okay. He's kicking. I'm definitely awake. Thank you, Howard Schultz and Starbucks. So that's ScottCast, the podcast number 25. 25. See you there? Wow, multilingual. I like that. Well, don't ask me too many more questions, but... anyway, episode 25 in the books. David Bilka, thank you for coming. Thank you, Scott. For anybody interested, they can reach out where? Office number 352-728-6789. My website, dbwealthmanagement.com. Cool. Or they can call our office. At the Huron Partners office, either one. That works too. You can call the international headquarters of Huron Partners. All right, well, that's episode 25 in the books. Peace.